You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Welcome to More Than a Fish, Season 2 of Raincoast Radio. I'm Auston Chor, a salmon habitat biologist at Raincoast and your host for this series of conversations about the connections between salmon, people, and place. My guest today is Jason Hwang. Welcome to the show, Jason. Jason's the Chief Program Officer and Vice President Salmon of the Pacific Salmon Foundation. His career in salmon science spans multiple sectors, including a long stint in the federal government at DFO, Department of Fisheries Oceans. He joined PSF in 2019 and has been the public face of the organization ever since. If you've seen someone from PSF being interviewed on the news, it's probably been Jason, at least in my experience. Last December, I had the pleasure of meeting Jason in person at a conference in Vancouver, where we shared kind of like an impromptu conversation about how our identities as children of immigrants has shaped our career paths and our journeys. And when I got home that day, I remember thinking man, I wish I had more time to talk with Jason about this topic because it was just such an interesting conversation that I haven't had in the past with anybody else. And so I'm really glad that you've been able to join us today. I'm sure your calendar is so slammed in the summer. And so, yeah, welcome to the show, Jason.
Well, Auston, thanks for having me, and thanks for that nice introduction. That was very kind of you. You know, another way to interpret it is I'm an old guy who's been around for a while, and you have to be careful with us old guys. You know, we'll always have opinions on things, but you have to weigh the weight of them carefully, I guess.
Yeah, so you are an old guy in your own words, but I want to say I had a really hard time finding anything online about your background or your story. And so I hope this is okay to ask you to talk a little more about your personal journey. So as you know, each salmon population is uniquely tied to what I'm calling home waters. They have unique adaptations, they have run timings, all sorts of things that link them to where they're born. Just to set the stage, Jason, where are your home waters for you? What are they like? It doesn't have to be where you're born. I'm interested more in the watershed or water body that you feel most connected to.
Well, I'd certainly say for me, the Fraser River would be the water body or place I feel most connected to. And when I say Fraser River, I mean the entirety of the Fraser River. I grew up in North Delta. Used to go fishing as a kid. I'd ride my bike down to the Fraser River in that area. As I started my professional career, when you alluded to me having worked at DFO, my second stint with DFO was up in Prince George on the Fraser River. I live in Kamloops now in the Thompson Basin, a tributary to the Fraser River. And last weekend, I did a big hike with my sons and their girlfriends up in Mount Robson Park at the headwaters of the Fraser River. It seems to be a place that I've got just natural ties to, and it's a place that has a lot of connection to my day job, but a place that I have a lot of personal affinity and identity to as well.
So more about your journey, I guess, from the Fraser. You alluded to a bit, worked at DFO. Could you tell me a bit about how you got to where you are today? How did you first realize working where you're working could be a career path?
Well, it's an interesting question. It takes you back to my sort of high school, post-high school days. And as a kid that grew up in sort of suburban Vancouver, didn't really know what I wanted to do. I went to Kwantlen College, did part-time studies. I did some business. I did some communications and marketing. I did some biology, and I was working full time, just kind of carrying on from my high school job, working full time at Canadian Tire, and thinking, well, I don't want to do this forever. It wasn't quite, my idea of a permanent career. It was a great job at the time, and I started thinking about, well, what do I want to do as a career? And I kind of weighed the things that seemed important to me at the time, and I thought I really want to see if I can find something where I can get paid to do something I really like to do. And then, well, what was that? And I thought, well, I like fishing. I like knowing about fish. I like the water. And I thought, well, what can you do with that? And looked around at what post-secondary options there were. And there's obviously, getting a degree at university, but I found the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Recreation program at BCIT. And I thought, oh, that sounds pretty good. 2-year commitment, get a technical diploma, and maybe from there you can get jobs doing things. And I applied there. I didn't get accepted the first time. I applied again the following year, was not accepted the second time. And sometime during the summer, probably roughly this time of year, I got a note saying, yeah, space had opened up. Do you want to go? And I decided, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So that was kind of the opening to the journey was fisheries and wildlife at BCIT. And I remember arriving there thinking, well, I'm going to be there with a bunch of other people like me. And in a way I was, but in a way I was like, I was this suburban kid with a bunch of people that already knew a lot of stuff. And they knew a lot about fisheries or forestry or wildlife, or they were from places like Williams Lake or Kamloops or Houston, up in Niskina, a place I hadn't even heard of when I, grew up in North Delta. And I thought, whoa, I don't know anything compared to these other students. But VCIT was a great place to get me exposed to that, to learn things that really let me see that there was potential in a career doing this kind of stuff. And for a guy like me, I was good at school in high school, but after taking a few years off, school was harder for me. And I think it was a good thing that I started at BCIT because it was practical. And, there's certainly academic stuff you have to learn, but it's got a practical aspect to it. And it helped me understand what I needed to know to then carry on through university. I think if I'd started at university and had to grind through calculus and organic chemistry, I'm not sure I would have necessarily seen the pathway, but having done BCIT first, I could more clearly see a pathway to applying the things that you then learn at university on your way to a degree.
So you touched on fishing. Was that something that you grew up doing and something that you and your family were, always fishing? You had strong connection to the river, or was that something kind of developed later on? Because I kind of have the same feeling that you did where you end up in school, you have a bunch of people who grew up by the coast or grew up fishing, grew up camping, that sort of thing. And you kind of feel all alone as this like person from the suburbs who kind of the first fish they caught was when they were 16 and not like 2. So was that kind of the same for you?
A little bit, but I did kind of grow up fishing, but not fishing like a salmon fisher person would think about today. I grew up fishing, catching bullheads on the pier at White Rock and throwing a crab trap in wherever we could, or casting a hand line off the seawall at Stanley Park when my family would go there for a Sunday afternoon and catching surf perch, or maybe, fishing a small stream tributary to the Fraser, or even fishing the Fraser River when I could ride my bike down there. So we didn't have a boat as our family. So, even if we went camping with one of my parents' friends, if they had a rowboat, I would like just be out on the rowboat all the time with my little fishing rod trying to catch a fish. So I did grow up fishing, but I didn't really learn how to fish in a good fisher person kind of way until I got my own car and had my own job and could buy my own fishing gear and go figure it out. My first salmon, I think I caught when I was 16 or 17. When I had a driver's license, I was working at Canadian Tire, and a guy that knew what he was doing said, "Hey, let's go fishing this weekend." So, maybe similar to you in that regard, but I kind of grew up dabbling in things that, no serious sports fisherman would kind of call fishing. But for me as a kid, it was like, hey,
It's just fish. Yeah,
yeah,
it is
and I
just
loved it.
fish. Yeah, that's really interesting. And like, I guess for me, it was such a cultural thing, like outdoorsiness and fishing as a hobby and not just like something you really did wasn't kind of something that we did in the suburbs. And I want to know for you if that was a barrier to even thinking about getting into the profession, because for me it was a little bit. It was like, no, it's not for me. I don't have this wealth of life experience, that prerequisite that I need to even think about applying to this stuff, right? Was that around for you as well?
Well, it probably was, but unlike you, I might have been a bit more oblivious to it. I wasn't a kid that, grew up on his dad's boat learning how to salmon fish, or in the family cabin outside of Williams Lake learning about deer and forestry and black bears or something like that. And when I got to BCIT, I realized, wow, almost everybody there knew something. A lot of them knew a lot, and I knew nothing in terms of the natural resource and management. And so it may have been a bit of a barrier, but it wasn't something that I was mindful of. And I think the other kind of related thing is growing up in suburbia, I didn't know anybody that did this kind of stuff. Like I didn't know a fishery officer or a biologist or a fish and wildlife technician. I didn't know anybody that did this kind of thing. None of my parents' friends did this kind of thing. I remember, my dad thinking, fish and wildlife, well, that's what you do for fun on the weekend. That's not a job, right? That's not a career. Maybe you should rethink that and practice your math and go be an accountant or something like that. So there were those kinds of barriers, but I think back, in my day, it was more imagination and motivation. Like, what are you going to do? And if you decide you want to do something, what can you do to make it happen?
So you mentioned you have kids. Are they in the same field?
One is still in university, but he's actually working for an indigenous fisheries entity this summer, and he's loving it. Yeah, and then my older guy is finished his undergrad, and he's working in I'd say a related field where they work kind of on relationships at the intersection of natural resource development, indigenous community relations, and government engagement.
And I guess I asked that because they're in a similar field as us. Have you seen that there's a difference in how the career landscape has changed since and how you get into it since you got into it versus how your kids got into it?
Yes and no. I think like in the big picture, I think the types of work and the amount of work and the types of career opportunities now are different and more broad ranging than they were when I started. But similarly, there's still not really a dummy's guide to jobs in conservation or careers in conservation. There's still a need to figure it out, to find people, who have perspective and see if you can get some of them to give you some time to help you see what's possibly out there. It's still, a very challenging job market, I think. When we post a job at PSF, we usually have hundreds of applications and dozens of high quality ones. And, to me, that's just a sign of the potential in terms of high quality candidates out there and the competitiveness and difficulty of finding a job and then letting that lead to a career. And that's similar to what it was when I went through, but different, in the modern context.
And as someone who's an employer, what advice would you give for those starting out on their career journey?
There's probably a two or three angles on answering that. But one that I would highlight that I think a lot of young people don't hear on in the early part of their career journey is to think about more carefully or more specifically, what is the landscape I'm trying to work in? Like we define this maybe as a conservation space, right? I think that you've used that term a couple of times. I've probably used it. You could define it as a natural resource management space, or if you choose to, you might look at the employment landscape a little bit differently. Like one of the things, and I will say I've probably got a personal bias here, so I'll just kind of lay that out. But I see quite a number of applicants, and I always have, even when I worked at DFO, who have very significant investments in postgraduate academic work, master's or maybe doctoral level or postdoctoral level. But then you look at what those are and the kinds of jobs that are out there. And, there aren't a lot of jobs for people with backgrounds in penguin research in British Columbia. And like, deep subject matter knowledge in the ecology of penguins or the ecology of sea stars on the barrier reef or something like that. And I think to some degree, it's an artifact of, well, how do you get there? Well, you go to university and do your undergrad. And then who are your mentors when you go to university to do your undergrad? They tend to be the profs at university. And what's their journey been? Well, they're smart and they're academically talented and they're generally research interested. And those are the kinds of worldviews they bring. And so if Jason or Auston goes up to a university prof and says, I'm just wrapping up my undergrad, and what's next? They'll say, well, here's your opportunities for a master's, right? But is that the path that you want to pick? Because if you're going to look for a job and you said, I could spend 2 years doing a master's, or let's say you could string together these part-time jobs or whatever, jobs that aren't your perfect cup of tea, but you could get 2 years worth of work. If after that 2 years you're applying for a job and you said to me, whatever, I'm talking to you and your twin brother, and your twin brother went and got his master's, and you spent 2 years carrying an electrofisher up through Devil's Club streams in the middle of the north, doing fish salvage for a pipeline or something like that, not your career dream job. But I start to ask you, well, how would you mitigate the effects of a road or a pipeline and maintain conservation priorities for natural resources? You're probably going to have a lot of hands-on experience and ability to do something that there's actually a job that they need somebody to do. If you come out with a master's, like think about how many master's students graduate every year, just in British Columbia, never mind Canada, never mind like North America, right? There are thousands and thousands of people with a master's that all have the same relative credential, right? I've spent 2 years, I've written something, it's publishable, and I've done the research to back it up, and I've held myself to that standard. It's a good credential to have. But these days, every second person or every person's got a master's. But can you do anything? Have you been in the field? Do you know how the world works?
Is it, I guess, a knowledge gap in thinking what your career is going to be and what jobs are actually out there? Like, I guess in my experience, when I did a master's and it was very research based, very academic, did thesis and everything. And I guess why I did it was I didn't know what the work was outside of seasonal work. And, I didn't want to do that seasonal work because I thought that, there is this prestige associated with a master's that it's going to get me a full-time job. And these are just seasonal jobs that I'm going to kind of string together, and, it's not going to lead to something permanent. And so I guess my question is, like, as an employer, is that something you're looking for? Something that you're weighing, Because my experience and my thought has always been, a master's is kind of required. And then you have all this field stuff because nobody's even going to look at your name unless it has a little MSc next to it.
Yeah, and I would say it depends. All right, and I want to be clear. I'm not saying getting a master's is not worthwhile. I don't mean that, but I mean to say it's and it kind of goes to a point you were making. So how do you know what's out there, right? And how do you know what is the background and pathway to get into that line of work? Like, what kind of conservation or natural resource management or sustainability and stewardship jobs are out there? And there is no catalog, right, that you can just look up online. There are things that give you ideas nowadays, things like the Eco Job Board, or even just, broad-based job boards like Indeed. You start looking at those and look at, well, what are the jobs? Who are the employers? What are the criteria they're looking for? And where there isn't a gap are smart people who have gotten a master's who can take those skills and assets and then carry them forward further in a career. There are lots of people like that. Like, that's not where in my hiring experience there have been shortcomings. Where it's harder to find people are there people here that understand how to work with Indigenous entities, who know the science, know the conservation of biology, but how do you go apply that in a present day Canada world where working with Indigenous entities is essential, right? That talent pool gets very, very much smaller when you start to ask that question. Or do you know how to work with Crown government entities? Do you even know what Crown government entities do? Do you know what their authority is? Do you know what the federal government does versus the provincial government versus local government? How all of that intersects with Indigenous rights? It's hard to learn that at university. I'm not aware of.
There's no courses in that.
Well, if there are, the people that are doing the science and the biology don't get them because they're over somewhere else in a humanities faculty or something like that. In general, right? Again, I'm not sort of the deep subject matter expert on this. I can just kind of express it from what I see in terms of the credentials that people who I've encountered have at their disposal. And the ones that stand out are the ones that have found a way to take what they've learned in the science and conservation academic training and then bring those applied real world circumstances together with that. And again, that's tricky because you generally can't just take a course that checks that box and says, okay, you're now, you've met the certification standard of how to work respectfully with Indigenous communities. And, you've checked the box on understanding the Constitution, the role of Crown governments, and how jurisdiction fans out in a way that is kind of foundational to natural resource management in Canada. But these are things, if you know some of that stuff, your employability and your utility and your opportunity transforms. But it generally, you only get the door open to that when you start getting experience. And so the longer you stay in school, unless you get a particularly good, and when I say good, good in an applied learning kind of way beyond the specifics of the science, but in applied learning, working with indigenous entities, government entities, industry, then you start to learn things that really transform your employability environment.
And I think that's really encouraging actually to hear from you as an employer, is that these soft, or what you call them, skills that you aren't able to get from traditional higher ed, those are the ones that are way more accessible to gain, right? Like, if you have the barrier to entry as a master's degree, you're going to be chopping off such a huge demographic of people just because of the barriers to entry to grad school, right? You need the money, you need the time, you need to not be working a job, you need to not be raising, kids or supporting anybody else. And so hearing that these are just as valuable, or if not even more, I think is something that a lot of young people these days need to hear and need to know, because there is a lot of pressure on people in the university sector to, constantly be chasing those academic achievements, because you're able to put them on your resume, or you're able to put them on your LinkedIn as, I have a degree in this, I published this. And it's harder in a way to communicate those experiences and those skills. Like, I worked here and here, and I understand all these things. So I feel like, if you're out there, young people, you should listen to this podcast.
Austin, I should be careful to qualify what I'm sharing as my opinion. And I would say my opinion doesn't match the majority of employment circumstances I see out there. A lot of entities want to see that master's degree just as a minimum qualification. I look at that and I think, if you've got your undergrad, and even that I would say isn't always an essential to me, but assuming you have your undergrad, you've proven that you've got some follow through, some academic capacity, some endurance in terms of being able to do the grind of an undergrad degree. After that, it becomes more of a master's is good. It counts for something, but so does having done something for 2 years, whether that's working for industry or working for a First Nation or working for a consultant. And what I think we're going to see, and this is, a prediction, it remains to be seen whether it evolves this way or not. I think in the employment environment in this, I'll call it natural resource management field, is going to backtrack from that a little bit and lean more to what can you do, and can you work in the professional environment. So it's going to be tricky for students and young people these days, but here's something that I think is highly likely to be true in the foreseeable future. In British Columbia, and probably in Canada, but I can certainly say this for British Columbia, every major development activity, every major thing that happens on our landscape is going to have to go through two big gates. It's going to have to go through sustainability, and it's going to have to go through reconciliation, right? It's going to have to find a way to make sure that we can have the mine or the pipeline or the housing development or the greenhouse or whatever it is. It's going to have to be reasonably sustainable from an environmental sustainability standpoint, and it's going to have to respect the rights of First Nations and ideally have the free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations with a right or an interest in that area. These are things that the traditional science training system don't necessarily teach you how to do, or if they do, they give you, the best they can do is kind of an initial orientation to these things. But if you can see those things and understand how the decision making world works around reconciliation and around conservation and sustainability, you are going to be right on the front edge and be marketable, I would say, for managing both our natural resources as well as being involved in future development activity. And that's where the jobs are, right? The jobs are in managing things that we want to change, either for development or for improving conservation outcomes or for managing natural resources better. There are some jobs just in terms of asking questions and research. Those tend to be more academically oriented, and that's like making the NHL All-Star team. There's a few people that will get those jobs. Most of us, like guys like me, I'm not going to make the salmon all-star team, but I could be a pretty good, part of the salmon crew in the background. And you need thousands of people doing that kind of stuff, right? So there'll be a few Scott Hinches at UBC or Jonathan Moores at SFU. I knew when I went to school, I was never going to be those guys. That wasn't my forte, but I like throwing on my waders and running around in creeks and talking to foresters and talking to developers and talking to farmers and saying, hey, how can we take what you're doing and do it in a way that is going to be better for salmon and for salmon conservation? And there's a lot of work in that space.
Yeah, and all this conversation is a lot like had me thinking of my colleagues and I always have this conversation at workshops or at conferences about how it seems like with all these environmental issues, the problem is no longer, or it's less so like not enough science to solve the problem. It's more not enough figuring out how to communicate or work with people and make compromise, and those social skills, that those are the ones that finally address the issues, get the things done, pass the policies, whatever it is. And my question to you is, like, let's say I'm a undergrad fourth year student, just have my BSc in biology. What are some things that I can do to train those skills, right? To get better at seeing the world more broadly and less as a scientist, to solve the scientific problems without, incorporating the human dimensions. What are some things that I could do?
Well, I'll just put a pin in something for a minute because maybe we can come back to it. But it isn't so simple that we have enough science. And I'd like to maybe come back to that because but what kind of science? And and maybe we can revisit it. But to your specific question, I think I'll give you a couple of response angles on it. And one, I'll kind of reflect on my personal journey. When I started, I kind of thought I'm on the conservation side. I've done some science work and management work, and those other guys are on the development side. And so it's us against them. And that was like the culture almost that I went through school in. And it's probably what I thought the first, I don't know, 5 or 10 years of my career. It's our job to protect the environment from these people that don't care about it, that want to cut down the trees for profit. The world isn't that simple, right? Everybody that I've ever met that works in the bush as a logger or a road builder, you know what guys that do that for a living do on the weekend? They go fishing and they go hunting and they go canoeing, and they don't want to wreck their environment. They care about it too, but they are pursuing economic opportunity that's available in the area that they work with, the skills or assets or interests that they have. There's a higher probability that they're your ally than there is that they're your enemy in most cases. But when you go through school, especially if you're in a conservation oriented, science oriented pursuit, you tend to not think about industry as a viable option. But we all know that we need critical minerals. We all know that we need basic minerals. Well, where do they come from? They come from mines. But how many people who go through a conservation science degree start thinking about, oh yeah, I'm going to go think about working for a mining entity? Well, mining entities need good people to understand the realities of mining, but also the realities of conservation, and say, what are our options? And I think it's natural for a conservation oriented student to maybe think about, oh, I want to go work at Raincoast, great organization, great reputation. Maybe they want to work at PSF. Maybe they even want to work for the government, right? Okay. But how many say, yeah, I'm going to go talk to tech and see what jobs are for mining, or I'm going to go to Mosaic and talk about how I can get involved in sustainable forest management, or I'm going to go to one of the consulting firms that we have lots of great firms in British Columbia who really work that middle space between the development entities and the regulatory entities. And they're the ones that are on the ground actually knowing what's there, what happens, and whether it worked or not. And that tends to be, at least in my experience, looked at as that's where you go if you don't get to work for Raincoast or something like that. But you shouldn't look at it that way, in my view, because what would be better is if you had really good talent and really good ideas in-house in those entities that are doing the work on the land. And for the most part, I think trying to do it in ways that are meeting our conservation and sustainability objectives. So it's kind of an orientation to your question around like how do you build those skills? Well, part of it is starting with how do you think about what your career options are and maybe try to think more broadly than just I'm in conservation because you can be in conservation but still working for a development entity as an example.
And in my experience, I had that very black and white view, going through university. It's like very easy to be in your academic bubble in a city kind of far away, never having met somebody who works in industry, right? And it wasn't until I, had a job at a consulting firm, I flew up to sightsee all the time to do some work on the bull trout there. And it really just took meeting somebody who lived there and who had a job in industry to understand like, oh wow, like my views that were so black and white are more gray now because they're these actual living human beings that I have met and had conversations with who depend on these projects to put their kids through school, to pay for their house, right? And without that physical and social meeting with and developing relationships and making friends and having beers at the bar, that flip I don't think ever would have happened.
Well, that ties into the other point I was going to make on this. Like I spoke about thinking about industry not as the enemy. The other point I'll make, and it ties to the thread I was on a few minutes ago, is there's a huge transformation underway in Canada in conservation and natural resource management and sustainability. And it's a giant shift of self-determination and assertion of rights by Indigenous peoples in Canada. And that's my description, right? I think the Indigenous peoples would, and friends of mine would say, Jason, we've always been doing this. And it's like, no, I respect that you have. But even entities that have been doing it for a long time are going from staffs of 4 to staff of 40, right? That like the capacity and the assertion of self-determination is transforming a lot of the work environment that is out there for people who are doing conservation or natural resource based science. And it's quite an interesting transformation that I don't think any of us know exactly how it's going to evolve and land in the coming years. But learning how to work with and maybe even thinking about trying to gain experience directly employed by an indigenous entity in a natural resource field, maybe even ideally in their territory, is again a really big door opener. And like Austin, you and I don't know each other well, but we've chatted, and I can relate to the idea of a kid that kind of grew up in one of the bigger metropolises in Canada, and you got your eyes open and you're thoughtful, but the reality of smaller town natural resource development landscape doesn't become real till you've been there. Right? Like when I first started getting jobs, one of my first postings was in Terrace. And in Terrace at the time, Terrace was driven by logging. And everybody there had some connection to logging. Even as a fisheries environmental consultant, I was doing work for a firm that was mostly doing contracting for forest entities. In this world, if you want to stay in the boundaries of Metro Vancouver, and be involved in conservation science and stewardship and sustainability type work, you are limiting your options for sure. That doesn't mean that there's none, but even if that's your long-term goal, I would say if you get out and do stuff for a while in the smaller towns where the resources are, where the fish are, where those people are, it's kind of like your apprenticeship, right? You go out there and do it, and yeah, maybe you want to move back to Burnaby or Maple Ridge or something like that. But if you come back to the city having done that, you will forever have the perspective and almost the cred of having been out on the land and spending not just drop-in time, spending I've lived here time with people in the places where this stuff is actually happening. Because Vancouver's a beautiful place, but if you look around, say, in the world of salmon, and put a map of salmon and a map of where the people are. The people are in these little corners of BC around Vancouver and Victoria. The salmon are everywhere else. And yeah, there are some salmon in our urban backyards and we're lucky for that. But the majority of what we're trying to manage, if you orient your perspective of BC to salmon, is well outside of your urban geography.
Yeah, those are all really great points, and I'm really glad to. It's really interesting to hear that from you, from the VP of PSF, giving all this advice that makes a lot of sense, but to a student who's in a bubble in the city, an academic, world, it's hard to wrap your head around unless, yeah, it's really, really grateful to have heard that from you.
Well, if you think about it, Austin, like, because you're not that far out of having done some of that work, were you open in your job search to jobs based in Fort St. John or in like Tahltan territory in Northwest BC or Heiltsuk territory in Central Coast or something? I'd say I wasn't. I didn't even know that those were options.
Yeah. No, I wasn't as well.
Yeah, but people that get those kinds of opportunities, they stand out. Like when I look through resumes, a lot of people have spent time in Vancouver, Victoria, right? But when you start to see, oh, I've been in the Skeena, I've been in the Central Coast, I've been at Haida Gwaii, or I've been in the Yukon, it gives me a sense of, okay, this person can relate more broadly to our world, and that's an asset, right? Even if you weren't there doing work professionally, even if you've lived there, like there's a lot of people that have never been to the Skeena. It's our second biggest salmon river, and and yeah, it's understandable. You need a reason to go there, right? But if we're trying to do work in the Skeena, it's pretty hard to look employable to work going on in the Skeena if you've never even been there. You can't say which way the water flows.
I do some work, most of my work now in Merritt, and that was, one of the biggest flips for me was, or I guess really big eye-opening moment was there was a couple months ago, there was a salmon ecosystems table workshop, and a lot of my work revolves around drought, revolves around water use in the cold water and the Nicola, and we were at a ranch and we were given a tour by John Anderson's son. I forgot his name. Anderson Ranch. I think they were like fifth generation ranchers on that land, owned the land right next to the cold water, and they were telling us, all of their ranching practices and how they were trying to make them as sustainable as possible, use all these like regenerative agricultural techniques, and that kind of dispelled this like boogeyman in my head that you have this big bad rancher who's just sucking all the water out of the river to make hamburgers, right? And I've found that it's been much easier to relate to people in Merritt after spending time there, after hanging out at the cafes, after going on a walk on the river, not even just in a professional sense, but just knowing what the local culture is like and what the context of how the city runs.
Well, when someone says the Coldwater River and you go, "Oh yeah, I know what that looks like. I've seen it."
Yeah, and I've been there. I've been on the banks. I've been in different sections.
Whereas, if you'd just driven Vancouver to Kelowna and said, "Oh, there's a river there. What river is that? I don't know. Which way is it flowing? I don't know. Are there salmon in there? I don't know." Well, you don't have you're bypassing an opportunity to know something and learn something. That kind of geographic exposure is really important because I'm sure in the work in Merit, you've been exposed to a lot of the Indigenous worldview and the First Nations priorities there. The Unlakatma nations are they're in that growth and self-determination assertion phase, at least in my view, that I've been describing. And that is a thing that people in this business are going to need to understand and kind of figure out a way to be comfortable with it, right? Because, if you, again, I can say this as a kid that grew up in the city, the first time you show up at a First Nation band office and you walk in, it can be intimidating, right? And even if everybody's really friendly, you don't want to say the wrong thing. You want to make sure you pronounce everything properly. Is this an Indian band? Is this a First Nation? Is this a chief? Is this a Cookpee? You got to do your homework, and even then you still might do something wrong, and you have to be ready to accept that with humility and grace. And they don't teach you this stuff in fish biology 404 at any university.
Yeah, and there were so many. I mean, we've worked with the guardians from CNA out there on our fieldwork, and it's not like I have taken these indigenous sensitivity trainings for my RP Bio designation, and I've tried to do my best to read all about First Nations, but it's not until someone shows up in their work truck and it's all these like little moments where there was a bunch of Devil's Club in the back, and oh, what's that for? It's like, oh, that's for medicine, or oh, I'm just collecting some of this for Sweat Lodge. And those little moments, like they're not actively teaching moments, but it's just the little bits that you learn from people just interacting with them. I think were so helpful to understanding where people are coming from and what they care about, way more than, your copper plate statement like, oh, they have a deep connection to the land. But like, what does that mean, right? Until you actually talk to somebody and see them, yeah, see how they relate to the land. And you can't do that unless you're there, right?
Absolutely. Well, and that kind of it's funny because you're providing a better answer to your question than I did in a way. Because you're talking about it real time as somebody that recently has been exposed to that and are seeing the benefits of being there on the land with the people in the territory at the river. And that's the difference, right? Like if you had done that before you did your masters, or you and your twin brother, right? Your twin brother did the masters and you went and did this. I think you could start to see there's advantages, disadvantages. Maybe the perfect package is finding a way to do both, but that there's no replacement and no substitute for that kind of direct firsthand experience and exposure. And whether you do that on a job, whether you do it as a volunteer or a stewardship support capacity, whether you do it kind of directly as the face of it or indirectly as a support person for something, you're still gaining experience and exposure to these things that are very valuable skills and assets in terms of how do I make myself more employable? How do I become essentially more marketable or more useful in the job environment?
So I was at this workshop in 2021 at CCFFR. It was a conference downtown Vancouver in the Park Hotel. There's this workshop about equity and diversity in specifically the fisheries field. And it was being led by Ivan Arismendi and Brooke Penaluna. These are two researchers from Oregon State. I think one of them is with the US Forest Service. And they had this big kind of study about how there was this big gap in both visible minorities and women, specifically in the fisheries field. They didn't look at any other field. And this was government and academic. And so, I identify as a visible minority. Jason, I don't know if you do as well.
It's complicated. Yeah, I could think. Uh, well, I don't want to go take you way off track, but I have resisted that in my time because my view, and probably get all kinds of hate mail for this, but my view is you don't want to lean in to categorizing people by saying I'm a visible minority, I'm not, or whatever. The intention is good, right? We don't want to have bias and discrimination, but then we should focus on not having bias and discrimination, not by categorizing people, which in itself is the first step in bias and discrimination. Like, what are you? Because someone who looks at me would say, "Oh, okay, he looks like a visible minority." Yeah, but my mom is English, right? As English as you can go, and so which half of me are you looking
Yeah.
at? Are you looking at the Caucasian half from Yorkshire, or are you looking at the Asian half from China by way of Calcutta and London? Like, what do you see? It's like, I'm just a Jason from North Delta.
I think this is a very reasoned take. Like, you're not going to get hate mail for this.
Well, but I say that because I think, there have been issues, in the past. I think there's still work to do in Canadian society. But I think focusing on removing barriers and removing bias is the priority. And I appreciate having classification and quotas. It's really hard to have things that are immeasurable, but I think that those might give you false comfort.
So what I'm interested is less so like the barriers to entry, but more so like for me, I feel like there was this almost like an intention barrier, right? Like I don't know if this is the same for you, where all of my Asian friends were like, I'm gonna go to be a software engineer. I'm gonna go to med school. I'm gonna go to law school. I'm like, wait, I like fish. Like what am I supposed to do, right? I can't go to law school. And so like, I don't know, has this happened to you? And how can we, because I'm sure other people are feeling both ways, like feel like you where I'm just a person and I feel I can do anything, and then some people are a little more like me where it's like I feel like I need to be pigeonholed into where I feel like I fit, right?
What I'm supposed to do. Although I did have some of that, like when I said at the start, I tried a little of this, a little of that, and my parents were, especially my dad, were a little like, is this a real thing? Is this a job? Is this a career? But I would almost like use your narrative and say, asking yourself the question, well, I like fish, so where do I fit? That's what people should do, whether it's fish or whether it's law or whether it's, software engineering or whatever, designing outdoor gear. Like pick your thing. And you hear these kinds of things. I heard it from somebody early in my career. They said, if you have to work for 30 or so years, it's sure a lot easier when you love what you do. And so finding a pathway to finding something that you really like what you do and then trying to find a place where you're really happy to be there doing it. I think that's the common recipe, whether it's the kind of field that you and I have chosen to go in or any other field. And it's sometimes a little harder when it's not what the people around you are expecting. But there is probably an added layer in terms of, immigrant backgrounds and cultural expectations that comes with it. And I think it probably explains to some degree why you do see fewer people from immigrant backgrounds, especially in the natural resources field. Or if you do, it's by way of engineering, by way of some other professional designation.
Yeah, like that cultural component I think is pretty strong and like shouldn't be ignored, where it's, it's not all, again, it's just like the world, right? It's not all big evil employers being biased and discriminatory. It's a lot of it too is kind of the how you grew up, right? Like, yeah, like I remember, my dad has a couple funny quotes where he's like, I escaped the jungle just so you could go and play in the jungle. Like, no, you could get a job like working hard. Like, no, you're gonna get a. And so there is that kind of like offhanded, like funny thing where like, oh, okay, I guess like I should have a better job than my parents, or I should have a better life than my parents growing up, right? And so there's that sort of, it's not negative, it's not ill-intentioned, but it's just this like something that immigrant kids just have that.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like I think my dad would love to meet your dad.
Yeah.
No, I think that's probably true. Like I would say I was lucky. I was given the space to pursue really what I wanted in my family, and I know that's not the case everywhere. And I think everybody's going to have their own journey, right? And what I think that what you're doing here in terms of this podcast and asking these questions is if people stumble across it and then they can start to contemplate options and realize, oh yeah, I've assumed that wasn't a path for me, but maybe it is. Maybe I shouldn't assume it's not a path for me. And I think that's a good thing. And that kind of takes away some of those potential barriers that might be there, even in an unknown way, where you were just saying, well, my field of opportunities over here on the white collar side. And it's like, well, you can be an applied scientist or a person taking science and putting it out there in an applied way without necessarily sitting behind a desk every day.
Yeah, like there are a lot of these internalized barriers. It took going to a job fair and one of my Asian friends going like, "Oh, I want to go to marine biology school," and I was like, "What? I didn't know we could do that." Like, it's like, what do you mean? Like, no, I want to be a marine biologist. Like, and that like really flips it. It was in Toronto. I can remember exactly him saying that and being like, maybe I should do this too. And that just kind of started off this journey about, now here I am.
Yeah, well, it does help. I think we've learned these kinds of things as a society. It helps when you can see people that could potentially be role models for you, right? It's one of the reasons it's been transformational in a really good way, where it's not unusual to see women in this profession. In fact, like I think PSF's got something like 65 or 70% women, not because of some particular affirmative action. It's just people of the current generation don't see that as a limitation, right? Well, I'm a woman, I can't be in salmon biology. It's like, no, of course you can. Are you a good biologist? That's all that matters. And it wasn't always like that, right?
Yeah, like I will say this is another, I don't know, my dad's going to come up in this podcast a lot, but I was applying for a job at PSF. I was applying for jobs everywhere, but I applied to a job for PSF and I sent my parents like they were like, "Oh, what is PSF?" And my dad like looked at the staff page. He was like, "Oh, hey, there's an Asian guy." Like, like everywhere that that this comes up, it's like, "Oh, okay, I guess you can apply there." Like, and so that's been my experience. It was really great to hear your experience as well. I have one last question, and it's pretty simple. It is, why are salmon more than a fish?
The questions like that can get me talking for
Here we go.
hours. But I think it's an interesting thing to contemplate. And one of the first things, if I've got 1 minute with people, I will tell them something like, just think about the journey that a salmon makes. It's one of the great global wildlife migrations, but it's kind of invisible because it happens underwater. It's farther than the Arctic caribou migrations. It's equivalent, at least, to things like monarch butterfly migrations, things that people know about. And there's National Geographic films about these, amazing wildlife migrations. And we have salmon that emerge from the gravel, this big, and make their way all the way, out their natal stream to the ocean, to the North Pacific somewhere, and all the way back. It's an amazing global migration, just purely as a wildlife spectacle. But then think about what that does in terms of the interconnectivity to the entire ecosystem. They actually connect the ocean and the inland areas everywhere they exist, up and down the coast of North America and over into Asia. And nothing else does that. Nothing else goes from the central North Pacific Ocean all the way up thousands of kilometers inland into British Columbia, and connects the ocean and our inland and freshwater ecosystems. And we've developed all of these amazing human and all of these amazing ecological dependencies on this grand wildlife migration that supports, iconic wildlife species like killer whales and grizzly bears and eagles and ospreys, and entire First Nations cultures and economies have been built on it. And modern Western society has developed all kinds of economies and practices around it, all for a fish. Like, if you think about it, it's like if you just said it's a fish, you go, oh, yeah, it's a fish. Well, this isn't the same as, say, a trout around here in Kamloops that spends its whole life in the same lake. It's a close cousin to that fish, but a salmon does something completely different, and in a way that I think is transformative to our ecosystems and our society. And that's why it's so important that we pay attention to them. It's not for the salmon themselves, it's because the salmon themselves represent this great connection. And if we don't steward it wisely, like, we're losing it right now, real time. This is, one of those truth hurts kind of things that people need to start recognizing. But we're losing this great global resource right in front of our eyes. And it's kind of been on our watch of people my generation, and we're handing a situation that isn't what we should be handing to people of your generation. And hopefully, some of us can at least give you a head start in trying to make things better. But I think it's a global treasure, just like the Amazon and just like other things like that that people recognize. And we're one of the only places left in the world that still has it. They used to have lots of salmon in the UK and in Europe. They don't have them anymore. They used to have lots of salmon on the east coast of North America. They don't have them anymore. There used to be lots of salmon in California and in the Columbia. They're still there, but not prosperous anymore. And we have places where we have lots of salmon that are still prosperous, but we have a lot of places where we used to have lots of salmon and now they're in trouble. And you think that's not a great narrative, and we have the capacity to do better than that.
And I think the PSF conference in December really exemplified that human aspect where, I could show up at the Vancouver Convention Center and it felt like 1,000 people there from all across the province, all different walks of life and backgrounds, and scientists and First Nations. And there was like so many people talking at the same time. There were big networking events. And I remember walking up the stairs and one of the staff, the janitorial staff, being like, oh, what are you here for? And I was like, there's a salmon conference upstairs. And they're like, a salmon conference? I'm like, yeah, you should come check us out. There's like 1,000 people up there. And they were just blown away by, just like I was, like the amount of people, and there were people from the States there too, that can care about one fish is incredible. I can't think of another animal that would draw that many people out to a conference to have like very spirited discussions and debates about, I don't think even like a panda convention could have the same level. But yeah, I think that's all for me.
Can I come back to something? I said to put a pin in that, in the science.
Yes, the not enough science thing. Okay, so I guess to clarify for me is the not enough science thing is very tied to, I always end up talking about climate change, right? Like, I guess the base science. We understand it's happening, we understand what it's doing, and that we caused it, and it's getting worse, and all these things science has, validated out the wazoo. So what do we do now, right? Is it more science? And so that's, I guess, how apply that to the salmon world.
Well, and that's where I'd turn it is there are some things that maybe we don't know perfectly, but we know enough that we should be changing our ways. But when it comes to the science to guide that applied action, we have gaps in that system. I'll give you an example. You made me think about this because you're speaking about the Nicola in the Merritt area. And so we know that there are drought issues. We know that there are flow challenges. We know that there are other issues. And what we don't know, you might correct me, but I don't think we know, okay, so what flows do we want in Merritt?
We only recently know this from a report that we
Well,
worked on.
but even that, like
It's barely, yeah.
we know that at the watershed kind of scale, like in general, more is better. But if you are the water manager and you have to choose between a little bit more water in the river or a little bit more water on a hayfield for a farmer whose entire farm economy is dependent on that, how do you make that decision? Do you have the information that you need to make that decision? What flow do you need? How long do you need it for? What is the benefit or loss to salmon in the aquatic ecosystem? How many days a week do you need that flow? Do you need it 24/7? Do you need it up and down? Do you need it, 1 week a month or on a constant basis? There's all this stuff that we don't know that gets to the idea of if you want to manage better, what do you need, right? The Merritt area is an interesting example. There's been historic acceleration in logging to chase pine beetles. There's been a lot of wildfire. There's been valley floodplain development for agriculture, over the last 100 years, water extraction, massive floods in the atmospheric river. It's been hammered by a lot of things. Okay, so what do we do? What things are going to make a difference for these fish at a population scale? I've been in rooms, friends of mine will say, well, we got to get a handle on logging. Okay, what does that mean, right? What forest management result do we want? And what evidence do we have to show that that is supported by science? Like there's all this kind of what I would call applied management science. It's different than exploratory research science, which tends to be a little bit more the norm of the academic emphasis, I think. But this applied management science, at least what I see in the world of salmon and the intersection between something like salmon conservation or aquatic ecosystem stewardship and what the economic development sector are doing on the land base is quite undeveloped in terms of taking science and putting it to applied use. And I think there's endless amounts of work needed there. And these are things that are going to come increasingly to the forefront as we start to wrap our heads around, okay, we have this salmon conservation problem. We have over 70% of our population is doing more poorly than long-term average. What's causing that? And what can we do about it? And there isn't really a system set up to do the science in a way that flows to applied management to allow you to answer those kinds of questions, like what's going on and what can we do about it? Because the system's never really had to grapple with those kinds of questions before. And so I just wanted to introduce that to that side of the narrative around, so where do you go for a career? Well, even if your interest is still science and research based, I think there's this whole world on the applied side of collecting real world data, interpreting it in a real world way to inform real world management decisions. It's stuff that I think people might think that the government agencies are doing, but go ask somebody who works for a government agency about how the cutbacks are going. The government agencies are doing less generally, not more. And these are things they've never had to do before. So they don't have the resources and capacity to do this kind of stuff. And so they're managing the best they can, but usually with very, very limited information.
For some perspective, last summer I was working on a project on environmental flows in the cold water. So we're looking at trying to determine, kind of like what you said, the optimum flow for each species of salmon at different life stages in this one river. And I remember being in the river constantly and thinking like, okay, this is applied science. We're going to come up with a bunch of relationships and some numbers that are going to, the big buzzword is inform management. But then what, right? Like we come up with a number. Let's say it's 5 CMS is a great flow for spawning Chinook in July. And let's say the Coldwater River cannot meet that flow without shutting off all the water users in July. And so then the end point of that is, now again, we're stuck at this like social science question. And economics question. How do we balance the needs of John Anderson, who's doing his best to make a buck? They're not some evil corporation. They're just people farming the land, but we can't let them take all the water that they want. Otherwise, salmon will not have water. And so like that is one area of expertise and experience that I feel like as a scientist, I have zero knowledge about how to work on, right? Like now we have this thing that we need to meet, but now we have these people that we need to impact, right?
Well, no, you're totally right. And I think that's the kind of example I wanted to illustrate in terms of there is lots and lots of work to do. You made this point, right? There's no end of work to do. And I think I've leaned a lot into practical, things that are maybe not so science and research based, but there's lots of science and research to do as well that can lean into some of these applied problems. And as you're touching on and rightly enriching the conversation towards, there's a natural resource science piece, but there's also a social science piece. And just put yourself in the chair of the statutory decision maker. I've got to decide, well, what do we do here? What are my tools? And right now, if you think about it, the tools are the same tools that you had in the Roman era. Turn water on, turn water off. That's it. There's no can I use technology to mitigate temperature so that the Chinook could be okay with a little less water? Not yet. Can we, I don't know, enhance thermal refuge areas so that we can live with some dry spots, but we can let the Chinook salmon ride it out as long as they get their water by October, and that leaves some water for the rancher, and the fish will do okay if we can manage more specifically. Like I'm making this stuff up, but exploring things like that will give us better ideas around what our options are and opportunities to actually put them in practice. And if you think about where are we going in British Columbia, the climate scientists are telling us we are not going backwards in terms of getting back to wherever we were 30 years ago. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Even if we stopped at pumping carbon into the atmosphere now, and we're not stopping pumping carbon into the atmosphere. So, how do we get ready for what the climate scientists tell us is coming? There's a whole world of work to be done there, and it's going to be very contemporary. Like, if we're going to need to build things like pipelines or things like highways or things like more housing, and that's going to come at the expense of a footprint on the natural environment, how do we mitigate that? How do we offset it? How do we manage for values of aquatic ecosystems? Like we know a lot, but there's way more that we don't know, especially on that applied side. Like what habitat restoration is going to work? What worked 20 years ago, is it going to work today? Is it the best thing to do? And that's all pretty exciting stuff, right? If you're somebody that maybe you don't want to go work with industry and you don't see yourself as a consultant and you want to do research, well, doing research like that is going to be profoundly useful. And I would expect research like that would be more likely to be fundable because people will see its tie to applied use in current context.
Well, that was great. I'm very glad you went back to that pin. Just wanted to say thanks so much, Jason. This was such a great conversation.
Thank you. I'm honored that you reached out.
I want to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
Raincoast Radio is hosted by Auston Chor and produced by me, Sophia Osborne. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.